Welcome to Mobilize Talks Podcast series, brought to you by Gilbarco, Veeder-Root, Middle East and Africa.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Mobilize Talks, where we are going to be unpacking the real operational challenges shaping fuel and convenience retail across Africa. Yep, my name is Moipone. I'm commonly known as Moi, and today we are diving into something that sits at the heart of every fuel retail operation, the tank. Now, while it may seem quite basic for a lot of us, the reality is that many fuel retailers still don't have the real visibility into what's happening inside their tanks. And when you can't see your fuel clearly, you clearly cannot control it effectively. So today we explore how that visibility gap impacts operations, impacts profitability and decision making, and how modern solutions are changing that. It is a pleasure to be joined by one of my colleagues and a good friend, if I may say so, Ben Chase, who's our Global Product Manager for the ATG. Ben, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Moi, it's always a pleasure to see you. I'm very glad to be here today.
Awesome. Well, if we're going to be talking to you about something this important, I'm sure the listeners would like to know a brief history of who is telling us about this. Can you give us a quick history of your career to date in this space?
Of course, I'd want to know my background too if I was listening to a podcast about underground tanks. It's only fair. So again, my name's Ben Chase. I'm Global Product Manager for the automatic tank gauge from Veeder-Root. And I really came up my whole professional career through the Veeder-Root organization. So I started in technical support. So I've got a really good background on the technical underpinnings of the automatic tank gauge. And then I moved into a commercial role, and I've been in product management for a couple of years, kind of helping shape the future of the automatic tank gauge. So my whole life, I've been Mr. Veeder-Root. I'm responsible for international markets, mainly for the automatic tank gauge. So for Middle East and Africa, I've got a really good understanding of what's happening on the ground through the automatic tank gauge lens.
Awesome. So we have somebody who's quite good in terms of their experience in what we'll be talking about. And I guess when we're talking about visibility gaps, sometimes it's just better to just start with a simple reality. So across many refuel retail sites, Ben, operators still rely on the manual dipsticks. They use spreadsheets or delayed reporting to understand their fuel levels. And this means that the most critical asset on the site is often managed with outdated or incomplete information. What do you have to say about that?
I think adoption of the automatic tank gauge really varies widely across different markets and different retailers. We've seen a lot of major key accounts kind of standardize on the automatic tank gauge as their technology with the way they want to monitor their underground tanks. But smaller customers, independent sites still really rely on manual dipping in a lot of markets, especially Africa. So we see major accounts kind of as the trendsetters here. The big national brands, they're the ones who are really picking up the ATG and setting the standard, saying this is a technology we believe in, and we expect the rest of the market to eventually follow that trend.
Interesting. And I see, in this day and age, why then would we still be seeing some retailers using the dipstick? In 2026, I would think that would have evolved.
The dipstick is perceived as really cheap and effective, right? It's inexpensive, and it's thought of as something that gets the job done. It doesn't cost much. It's just labor. It's a wooden stick, and then it's some paste on that stick, right, for water detection. So if you're really concerned with, I just need my tank levels and I just need it twice a day, it's going to get you pretty close, right? But I think that really misses the bigger picture in terms of understanding what's going on with your tank health and then really getting crystal clear data about what's going in and out of that tank.
So what is it that the dipstick is not telling them that they don't know?
There's a lot that a dipstick won't tell you. If you think about the human error piece of the puzzle, you've got somebody going in with a stick and manually dipping into a tank. And there can be slight variances in angles in the way that stick goes in, or somebody cannot push it all the way to the bottom. That inconsistency in the behavior of stick reading can give you inconsistent readings. And that can lead to all sorts of different issues. There's also log manipulation risk. You've got somebody manually writing in tank levels when you've got a dipstick, and that can increase the risk of somebody maybe manipulating the logs to make it easier to pull some excess fuel out of the tank. It's something we do see pretty consistently in different markets. There's also leak detection, right? It's very easy with an ATG to track fuel leaving a tank in minute amounts. It's not so easy when you're hand measuring levels and then writing them into a log. You also miss some key things on run out alerts, tracking overfill likelihood, and then there's health and safety as well. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention health and safety. I like to tell a personal story with this. One of my first jobs was as an aircraft fueler. So I worked at a small airport and I used to fuel up planes with kind of an overwing fueling technology, pumping out of like a Bowser truck. And I had a piece of equipment that was not performing well and didn't automatically shut off. So I had kerosene fuel, Jet A fuel, spill all over me as a result of that. And I actually got really, really sick. And I like to tell people that story as a reminder that fuel fumes, liquid fuel, is not something humans are designed to be exposed to. So we really need to consider for our workers, there's a real risk of having them inhale these fumes consistently when they're doing tank dips. So important to consider that when you think about the overall value of automating that instead of doing the manual dip.
And I'm hearing you talking about all that, and I wonder, is there any real financial risk when you don't have the accurate tank data in all that?
There's actually a very real financial risk, and it probably makes sense to walk it through kind of like a 1-year example and get tactical with it, right? So if we think of kind of a middle throughput site, right? If you have a fuel runout condition, say just once a year because of poor record keeping from stick readings, you might get 24 hours of downtime from that outage. One simple 24-hour downtime can cost you over $1,000 in lost revenue. On a busy site, it could actually be triple that. If we then add in theft and fraud as a secondary lens, in many parts of the world, Africa included, fuel theft remains a very real problem. We see short deliveries all the time, and whether it's intentional or not, it is a major trend in the market still. So if your monthly throughput is 100,000 liters and you're losing just 0.01% of that from someone skimming in the supply chain, that can cost you like $1,200 a year. And some sites are losing way more than that. There's also the labor overhead from paying someone to dip the tanks and do the inventory reporting. While that's kind of a sunk cost because you're already paying that salary, right? There's opportunity cost to somebody doing that work. You know, they could be doing some other important job at your site, maybe something that helps create some additional traffic or incremental revenue. The last thing I want to mention too is variance detection. Let's say you have one poorly calibrated dispenser on the site, and that dispenser is pumping 20,000 liters per month. If that meter is just 0.5% miscalibrated, you could be pumping 100 extra liters a month that way. And over the course of a year, that's another $1,100 in waste. So if we think about this one site with these different loss vectors that are hitting it from manual dipping, you can say there's over $3,000 in lost revenue or wasted fuel. And I think those are very real world conditions that we see all the time and maybe are even pretty conservative in some ways. So you start to think about over a 5-year horizon or a 10-year horizon, there is a lot of financial risk associated with manual dipping, and you can really help control that with an automatic tank gauge instead of a manual dip.
Wow. Ben, I'm just listening to you, and these problems seem to be so many. But I guess the good news is that the problems can be increasingly solved with the modern fuel monitoring technology that we see. Technologies like the automated tank gauging, which we normally refer to as ATG, would help solve some of these problems. And I'm wondering how people are then managing their wet stock changing with all this technology that we're seeing coming into the space.
You know, I like to use this analogy. If I want to check my bank account in 2026, I pull out my phone, I open up the app, and I read my bank account right there, right? I don't walk outside. I don't walk down the street. You know, I don't walk into the bank and ask the teller. And I think ATG is a pretty comparable version of that, right? I think ATG is a pretty comparable example of that. You know, you can pull out your phone and take a really quick look at your tank levels instead of going outside, opening the sump, opening the tank, putting in the manual stick. You know, it's a very apt comparison. You can get all that right on your phone. I think that's the biggest difference today with how people are managing their wet stock.
Wow. And we just went right ahead and started speaking about the automatic tank gauging, which we refer to as ATG, before we really took a step back and explained exactly what an ATG is and how it works and what it does. Ben, can I just please ask us to just take a step back for the listeners and explain what exactly is this ATG that we're talking about?
That's fair. That's a good call out. I should probably rewind and talk about what an ATG actually is, how it works. Think about an ATG as a controller. It's like a computer on a wall that has some actions it can do and takes in some sensor readings, basically. So when you think about monitoring a tank, the key piece is the ATG and then the magnetostricted probe that goes down into the tank. Think of the probe as kind of a long metal shaft with two floats on it, one for water levels and one for product levels. We basically shoot an electrical signal down the probe. It bounces off the floats that are riding the water in the product, and then it reports it back to the automatic tank gauge, where it can give you those levels on a screen, or it can push them to the app so you can read it on your phone. And it can also take actions based on those levels, right? You could, for example, shut off your submersible turbine pump and stop dispensing if your product level got too low. So that's the core job of an ATG. It's to monitor your tanks and the conditions around it, and then to take actions based on those monitored readings.
That is quite interesting. I mean, earlier on, we were talking about the manual dip that some of the dealers are still using in this age of technology. And just as you were talking about the ATG and exactly what it does, I was wondering what the advantages would be over manual dip for those people who are still stuck on using the dip and not understanding some of the advantages that the ATG has got for them.
Sure. So time is limited, Moy, so I'll have to condense this. But there's a lot of advantages we can squeeze in here. Being able to automated monitoring your tank in real time is a huge advantage over a manual dip that only happens twice a day, say, for most tanks. So you're going to get that real-time consistent data as it happens instead of waiting for that dip point. The ability to detect water detection. We know there's water detecting paste out there, but it's not always used when guys go to do the dip. A lot of times that step gets missed because it's an extra layer that they don't necessarily want to do. Having the visibility to your tank levels remote, like we talked about on the PlusView app, is a huge advantage. The ability to reconcile your deliveries with a really precise level of accuracy, another huge advantage. Things like density tracking, fuel quality and bad deliveries is something that is a real world trend right now. And we can monitor density of your delivered product with our probes. Another advantage. Phase separation, we could talk about, water detection. When you've got water going into a high ethanol fuel content, that water can actually hide inside the ethanol in kind of a special layer that develops. And that can damage vehicles when you pump out into it. So the ability to detect that phase separation, really important and something a stick doesn't do well. And then, of course, the ability to shut down dispensing if a dangerous condition is detected, also really important and something you can't do with a manual dip. So tons of advantages, Moy, when you talk about the automatic tank gauge versus the manual dip process.
I can hear that. And I guess one would have to practically be doing it and experiencing it to understand technology. But as you said, Ben, time is not on our side. We need to wrap it up. And I would really appreciate it if you could just take the last few minutes to just actually let the operators understand what this means for them, having an ATG on their side, high level.
Sure. One thing I think it's important to mention as an operator is the ability to triage your sites and understand what needs what and when is really important. So if you're managing even just 10, 20 sites, right, you're going to want to know what sites need your attention on a daily basis. Having an ATG is going to help you understand that in real time and look at your network and see problems as they arise instead of waiting for those diffs to understand what's going on. So if you see an alarm, that site needs attention. If you see a low product level, that site needs attention. It really helps you manage what's going on for your whole network as it happens, right? So that's really important. I think margin expansion, another thing that is really important to a lot of retailers right now, getting the most out of the money you spend on your fuel. With theft as such a real problem today and variance control coming up for a lot of customers, getting a really close look at, hey, what are my variance sources in terms of dispenser miscalibrations, in terms of leaks, in terms of theft, in terms of under delivery, the ATG helps you control all that and really protects your bottom line dollars. Fuel quality. Another thing we need to talk about, right? We mentioned density. We mentioned water getting pumped out into deliveries. You want to know that the fuel you're paying for is the quality you expect. And again, an ATG is going to help you do that verification of your deliveries as they happen. The other things I want to mention, the environment, right? Whether it's health and safety for your workers or leak detection for your groundwater in the area of your retail fueling station, an ATG is going to help you protect the environment around you with those different controls. The last thing I want to mention is regulation preparedness. We're seeing fiscal regulations spread all over the region. I think environmental regulations will be following that. And ATG helps make sure you are ready for those regulations before they happen. And I think that really gives our customers very strong peace of mind. So there's a ton for operators that gives you a real advantage when you install an ATG instead of depending on that manual dip.
Whoa, we could go on and on. Like you said, there's so much information we can share on this topic, but I guess we have to be considerate of time. Thank you so much, Ben, for joining me today in this conversation. I really appreciate your insight on this topic, and it's always such a pleasure having conversations with you. It's always so insightful.
It's always great to see you, Moy. Happy to talk again if you've got more questions on the ATG and what it means for your region. As you know, I'm very passionate about it, and I love talking about it.
I know you do, and I love listening to you talk about it because I always learn something from the conversations we have. I mean, we've had multiple conversations on this, but every time I walk away with something new. So I really appreciate that. And to our listeners out there, thank you so much for joining us. Stay tuned for our next episode.
Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for our next episode.